Sometimes we get into habits and doing things that are a little bit hard to break unless we're really concentrating. I'm in such a habit of when I get here on Sunday mornings when class starts of going and locking doors and stuff that even though I knew I was supposed to be teaching class this morning, I headed down the hall and started locking doors and stuff. So I ask you to forgive me for that. But anyway, we're studying this morning in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. Ecclesiastes chapter 2. I listened to Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and most of the rest of the book of Ecclesiastes about 50 times this week at work, so you'd think I'd have it memorized, but I don't. But nevertheless, it's an interesting book, Ecclesiastes is, and as we talked about, it's basically contrasting the between living your life and the things you do with God in your life and with the goal of serving Him, or with living your life with just worldly pursuits in mind and a goal of serving yourself. And so as we start in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, the first question in our lesson says, having tested wisdom, madness, and folly, what did the preacher experiment with next? So we'll read a little bit down through here and then comment about these things. Ecclesiastes, I can't hardly talk this morning. Ecclesiastes chapter 2 and verse 1. Said, I said in my heart, come now and I will test you with myrrh. Therefore enjoy your pleasure, but surely this also was vanity. And I said of laughter, madness, and of mirth, what does it accomplish? I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the sons of man to do under heaven all the days of their lives. I made my works great. I built myself houses and planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants, and I had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all those who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers and the delights of the sons of men and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. Then I looked on all the works my hands had done, and on all the labor which I had toiled, and indeed all this was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. So we see here, as we read that in verse 1, he says, he said in his heart, come now and I'll test you with myrrh, and therefore enjoy pleasure, but surely this also was vanity. When we read that word mirth, as it has it here in the New King James Version, and I think also the King James, what does that word mean to you? When you think of that word, how would you define it? Well, I looked it up, and according to Webster's dictionary, and I didn't write down all the words in it because it seemed like it took half a page, but the definition of it has to do with merriment, amusement, fun, pleasure, festivity, frolic, sport, revelry, or merrymaking. So as I read this verse and look at that definition of the word, and it includes pleasure in this verse also, it says, surely all this was vanity. What comes to my mind is Solomon said, okay, I've tried other things, and that didn't work, so he was going to apply himself to basically, it seems to me, like throwing a wild party and living a party life and seeing how that worked for him. And so he says all that. But when we think about that, and we look at all these things, now while it's not wrong to enjoy ourselves, I don't believe, to maybe be amused for things, to have fun or pleasure, but when you take it out of hand, it gets to be a problem. And I think that, and we see people that, I've worked with people that kind of lived in the past that lifestyle. I guess you'd call them, a phrase I've heard used as party animals. I mean, they lived for the weekend. This one shop I remember specifically, we worked 6 days a week. And these people lived for when we got off at 2 o'clock on Saturday because they was headed straight here and there for their weekend of wild partying. But Solomon says, when he says this, he said, but surely all this was vanity. And so when you think about it, if that's what your goal in life is just to live from one wild party to the next, what good is it accomplishing you? How's that helping you in any way? From a worldly standpoint, yeah, you had a really good time. But it reminds me of this one fellow that I knew of that lived that way. He went out and he got just plastered drunk every Saturday night. And he'd come in on Monday morning at work telling about the wonderful fun time he had on Saturday night. But then the next thing he was telling you is that he was so drunk he couldn't really remember what he did on Saturday night. But he was sure he had a fun time. But what he could remember was being sick with a hangover and throwing his guts up on Sunday morning, half the day Sunday, trying to get over the party and he'd done Saturday night. So I'm thinking, okay, I know when you left here Saturday afternoon, you had $500 or $600 in your pocket, and now you're broke. So you blowed your money and you don't have anything to show for it. You really don't know what you've done, but you definitely remember being sick. It sounded to me like that was a really grand lifestyle. So I think that's what Solomon's saying here. You know, this wild party, if all you're living for is just from one party to the next, one fun thing to the next, or something like that, there's no profit in it. Because at some point in your life, you get old enough that you can't do that anymore. Your body just won't hold out to do it. And then what have you got to show for a wasted life? Just one wild party after the next. As Solomon says, it's vanity, or it's wasting your life. There's no profit in it. There's no point to it. So as we read that verse, chapter 2, verse 1, he's saying, that's what he's telling us, I think, is that if all our life is just one merriment or one fun thing after the next, and that's our goal, we're wasting our life. We don't have anything to show. Any questions or comment about that? Tom?
So those to your verse 2, where he goes through, actually reading 3, it says, I spent my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely how to take hold of the folly. So he's sort of showing a contrast to, you know, in one way he's thinking, look, you know, let me go out and party, but somewhere back there saying, well, you know, there really isn't any good to that, but, you know, but which one won't open? That's sort of, you know, looking at temptation. You know, sometimes wisdom says, well, we really shouldn't do that, and we realize that, but then sometimes we go ahead and do it anyway, just because we let folly take over wisdom. And, you know, Solomon's sort of in that sort of same concept that we are. And then as he goes through, he progresses through these next few verses, he takes different aspects of things that most people find pleasure in doing or accomplishments, and then he shows that really, you know, sort of contrasting. Did that really do anything for him?
Yeah.
And, you know, so it's interesting how he goes through it. Even though he's saying, you know, here, let's go through all this pleasure, still he's showing that, you know, that wisdom has a, you know, a grasp on what he's doing.
Mm-hmm. As we talk about that, and he's talking about it as wild parties here, he says in verse 2, I said of laughter that it's madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? And so he's contrasting that. And then he goes down into verse 3, and I think showing another contrast, because these first couple of verses, I think he's talking about just a wild, grand, fun time. That's all he was being worried about. And in verse 3 it says, I searched my heart how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, how to lay hold on folly till I might see what was good for the sons of man to do under heaven all the days of their lives. So in verse 3 as it starts out here, it seems that he's talking about, instead of just one big wild blowout party, he's talking about going to party a little bit, or in a more moderate way. I'm still going to do things. I'm still going to engage in the drinking of wine, but I'm going to try to do it in a way that I can guide my heart with wisdom. So it's not to the point like the guy I was talking about. He was so drunk, he's passed out. He didn't know what he was doing anyway. So Solomon's saying here in verse 3, so I decided to approach it from a more moderate way. I still want to engage in some of this stuff, but not with the big wild blowout like I was doing. But I want to be able to keep my wits about me, so to speak, which I think is interesting. And as he goes on and talks about the vanity of this kind of thing, we know, medically and scientifically speaking today, that from the first drop of an intoxicant that we take within us, whether it's alcohol or drugs or whatever, even though it might be a small amount, it's affected our mind. It's affected our ability to think and make rational judgments. So to say, well, I'm going to, and I've known people that's talked about this before, well, I didn't drink much, I just got a little buzz. Okay, so you just got a little buzz, so what you're saying is you were impaired. And we know, medically speaking, from the first drink we take of alcohol, we're a little bit impaired. And so to say that I'm going to do this a little bit, but I'm still going to keep my wits about me, is still saying I'm going to mess myself up some. I mean, I'm not going to be able to think clearly, because when he talks about keeping wisdom about you, ultimately, if we're wise, for me at least, I don't have enough brain cells functioning in a really high and grand way that I can afford to have any of them not working good. I need every chance I got in order to try to make my way through life and not just have catastrophe after catastrophe. And I feel like probably I'm at least average, so I don't think most of the rest of us has got no spare brain cells that we need to have impaired either. And so to say, well, I'm just going to drink a little bit and it'd be okay, I don't think that works. I think that's a contrast here. Either you're going to be gratifying your flesh with wine, or you're going to be wise and avoid that kind of thing altogether. I don't think there's really an in-between there. But I think it's what he's talking about here. You know, I went from a wild party, just a constant party life, a party animal, to just a more moderate thing, and that's not working either. And so he says, I want to try to see what's good for the sons of men to do. Basically, it's saying, I think, one translation says he wanted to draw out with wine his appetites. And I've known a lot of people that had that kind of attitude before. They just wanted to drink a little bit because it made them feel good. Or I know it was my mother's first cousin. I guess it makes him my second cousin, but he was her age. And I remember one time at my grandmother's house, he was talking about he could have a couple of beers and how much sharper that made his mind and his senses and how superior that made him, he thought, in a lot of ways. And in the next verse, he was talking about getting pulled over for going 80 miles an hour in a 40-mile-an-hour zone or something. But he thought he could drive a lot better when he'd had 2 or 3 beers. Well, it's just fooling ourselves if we're doing that. It's just vanity. And I thought even for him, you know, you're saying it makes you sharper, but you got a speeding ticket. I mean, it didn't go good together. It wasn't a logical deduction, I think we could say. So I think Solomon's showing us here the party life ain't working. The moderate party life ain't working. He tried all that and it didn't work for him. And so then he decided he's going to go out and see what else you could do to make what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives, it says in verse 3. Let's see. So then verse 4 says, I made my works great. I built myself houses. I planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards. I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants and had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem. I gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings. Of the provinces, I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kind. I became great. And as you read down through here, these verses 4 through 9 here, or 10 really, I don't know how many, I meant to count them up and I didn't do it, but how many times he said, it's either I, me, or myself. Basically what he's saying, or what and the lesson didn't really, in our book didn't bring this point out, but as I studied through that this week, I thought it was basically a focus on self, a self-centered person. You know, I made this, I acquired that, I got that. And it's over and over and over, it's all about him. And I believe we can see that when that's our thoughts in life, our goal in life, and that it's all about me, it's really not a very satisfying life. James?
Yeah. It seems like that he's focusing on himself, like I said. It's not the works of God he's focused on. This, part of the sermon, he's not concerned about spiritual things at all. It's what, in a physical way, can I do and I accomplish that can bring true value or lastingness. It's not vanity. And he's done what people think are amazing things. He's built these humongous structures and beautiful gardens, things that caught our eye are beautiful, but they're not lasting. Nothing works because it's strictly him. He's not focused on God's works, the works of righteousness, what he can do to make himself feel important, but it never really works.
Yeah, this being self-centered doesn't work, because ultimately the things that mean the most to us in our life are things that we can do for other people, things we can do to help others. That has a lasting effect on our life. The things I do for myself or the stuff I acquire for myself, oh yeah, I've got some neat stuff, but even the neat stuff I've got, it's got to be maintained or whatever, or it's going to rot and rust and fall apart. So stuff that I get from me, if I, like he talked about here, planting a grove, he's planted himself an orchard. Well, that's a nice thing to have an orchard. There's nothing wrong with that. But to say, look what I've done, well, yeah, you did it, but now you got to keep on doing it because it's not going to last. If you don't keep the orchard, the trees trimmed, the ground mowed around it and soil fertilized and all these things, then your trees are going to grow up and get all gnarly and they're not going to make much fruit and all that. So it's still, it's still a sort of a self-centered. It's something you've got to constantly maintain, but it's not something you're accomplishing for something else. And he's going to go on to talk about that some more here in a little bit. Somebody had their hand up.
It sounds a whole lot like the parable, of the rich farmer that had abundant crop. He had to tear down barns, build new barns. He failed to give God, the credit for what he had.
Yeah.
That's what we do to ourselves. Sometimes we just fail to recognize that God has blessed us in a way that we had this, and we should give him the credit for what we have, instead of trying to think it's all our goods.
Yeah. Okay. Somebody, Tom?
Just, you go through and talk about some of these things, but then, that he did for himself. Then he says, well, then I had to have all these servants. Well, why did you need the servants? Well, you got all the stuff that you need somebody to do it. You couldn't maintain it yourself, so you had to acquire the personnel to keep it up for you. And then, and to the point where he bought them and he raised them. In his time frame, there were male and female slaves that he bought, and there were ones that were born in his house. So he perpetuated what he needed to keep going.
Basically what he done is he made a lot of work for himself, is what it boiled down to. Something I just now thought about, I remember once talking to the high school class in the place we was studying, I don't remember where it was right now, but talked about I think it was Paul talking about it, and it probably had to do with spiritual gifts and stuff, but the principle I think stands on worldly stuff, and Paul said, what did you have that wasn't given to you? And ultimately, when we think about it, what do we have as a possession or whatever on this earth that wasn't given to us by God? Our stuff God blessed us with, our families God blessed us with. If we've got the ability to have some intelligence to be able to accomplish some stuff, God blessed us with the intelligence. I mean, everything we got ultimately is a blessing from God. And so we shouldn't get big-headed or conceited. I mean, maybe I next week come up with some brand new wonderful invention that's going to revolutionize the whole computer industry. And most of you know I'm not computer literate, so that's not going to happen. But nevertheless, let's just say I did that. Well, it really ain't no grand accomplishment of mine because I didn't invent computers. But even that, the technology and the materials and stuff, all that's made out of, God give it to us. And if I could come up with some grand, wonderful idea and do something like that, the intelligence that I came up with, that I had to do that with, was a blessing from God and a gift from God. So when Solomon talks about here all these things he's done, he made himself gardens. If God hadn't have made plants and trees and stuff like that, there wouldn't have been no gardens. So it's not like Solomon done it all himself. God provided that to begin with. We go down through here. Let's see. Built myself houses. And one of the questions down here had to do with the houses, I see. Question 6. Some other Bible passages list the houses Solomon was known to have built. If you look in 1 Kings chapter 9, in verse 10, it talks about him building the house of God. He built the temple. We know that took 7 years, and as we read the description of that, it was a really grand construction project. And then it talks about him building his house, and it took him, I think it was 13 years to do that. And it talks about he built his wife, Pharaoh's daughter, a house. And that was in verse 24 of 1 Kings chapter 9. And then also in 1 Kings chapter 9, I think it is, or another place, it talks about the house that he built at the Cedars of Lebanon. And then it talks in chapter 9 of verse 15 about walled cities that he built. And then it talks about in verses 17 through 19 of other cities that he built. Solomon built a lot of stuff. I mean, he had a lot of work going on. But ultimately, if you think about it, the grand house he built for himself that took him 13 years to build in Jerusalem, what was the point? It's gone. He built this big elaborate house. The one he built for his wife, it's gone. All that stuff he built is gone. The temple that he built, it's gone. So in one way of looking at it, if you're just looking from a worldly standpoint, from a worldly view of things, everything Solomon done, in a way, he wasted his time because it's all gone. You know, it's been probably, I'm thinking, around 3,000 years since then. So, I mean, things have had a lot of time to decay and go away. But we know of conquering armies come in and tore all the stuff down 2 or 3 times. So what Solomon did here, as far as a worldly standpoint, is saying, look at what I built, look at what I've done. Well, what was your point? It's all gone. It's a waste of time in some ways of looking at it. Not that it was wrong to do those things or build them things, but if you're just doing it for praise for yourself or to glorify yourself, you didn't accomplish nothing because it's going to be gone. 2 years ago, we built a house down there on the farm. The house Josh lives in down there, parts of it's probably around 100 years old, a little bit more, and you can tell that it's not what it once was. Probably in the next 100 years, both of us' houses will be gone. I have no reason to think otherwise, really and truly. They'll be gone. So, yeah, we built what to us is a really nice house, but it's not going to last forever. It's going to have to be maintained and things going on. So ultimately, other than the fact that we needed a place to live, it was sort of a vanity. I mean, it's just, there's no lasting benefit to it ultimately. Let's see. And then we go down here in question 6 in the second part says, give some indication of the amount of silver and gold that Solomon accumulated. And I think we talked about this some last Sunday morning. But as I was going through, and I know I probably didn't find every place there was, but in 1 Kings chapter 9 and verse 28, I think it is, it says that Solomon acquired 420 talents of gold. And I've done some math, and that's 405,099 troy ounces of gold. And then another place it talks about Hiram gave him 120 talents of gold, and that's another 115,742 troy ounces of gold. And then it says that he got 666 talents of gold a year. And I didn't write down the number of ounces that way. I did. 970,309 troy ounces of gold was the total of all this, 1,006 talents. And that works out to being $1.7 billion. The 666 talents of gold a year he got was $1.1 billion if I'd done the math right. And so Solomon, as far as gold goes, was filthy rich. And if you think about it, in the 40 years that he reigned, if he got that 666 talents of gold every year, which is what it says his yearly income was, that was about $44 billion right there, not counting whatever else he made. And we read about how he bought chariots and horses from Egypt and sold them to other nations around and talked about what he sold them for. So Solomon was an industrious person, and he had a lot of money and made a lot of money. But when you think about it, however much money Solomon had, it's all gone. Somebody else has it now. It didn't do him a lick of good in one way of looking at it, because it's all gone. So just having stuff, just to say you have stuff here, just having these accomplishments that you build, properties and grows and orchards and all these other things, just having it just for the sake of having it is not any good. If you're going to have stuff, you need to be using it. And you ultimately, if you're going to have a spiritual benefit from it, which is what we should be doing everything we do in our service to God and trying to find a spiritual application to it, ultimately, if we're not finding and using it in the service of the Lord, then we've completely and totally wasted our time. Any questions or comments? I kind of get talking sometimes and don't hardly look up or let up. But anyway. Question 7 down here says, verse 8 speaks of the delights of the sons of men, and what is this? Now in the New King James Version, it said, at the end of verse 8, it says, the delights of the sons of men in musical instruments of all kinds. Several of the other translations that I read, probably the majority of them, said that was many concubines. So basically what Solomon's saying here, not only with all these physical things that I do, these construction projects and all these accomplishments I did, he said, I decided that, I was going to have me a bunch of women, and we know that he had 300 wives and 700 concubines. What in the world a man would need with 1,000 women is beyond me. It's hard for me to keep up with one woman. I don't need 1,000 of them. And when we think about it, that it talks about, as we read on further about Solomon, that when he was old, he let his foreign wives lead him away from God, and he started worshiping idols and building temples to them and things like that. If a person can't have a good spouse that's going to help him to be a Christian, he'd be better off to have no spouse. Solomon with all these wives, if they'd have been good women, which for him to have all these women was a violation of God's commands to begin with, because God had said that the kings were not to multiply wives unto theirself. Now, I don't know how far you'd have to get to call it multiplying wives. We know that David had several wives, but Solomon had 300 wives and 700 concubines, and however you would work it out to determine where multiplying wives to yourself is, Solomon had to have been in the middle of it. I mean, he had to have been there in the multiplying wives to himself. I don't think any logical person would dispute with that. So he had a bunch of women. And then a bunch of his wives were foreign wives, which God had told the children of Israel in the law of Moses, don't be getting no foreign wives. When you go into the land of Canaan, don't be taking wives for your sons from there or giving your daughters to those people, because they're going to lead you away. And what happened to Solomon? His foreign wives led him away. So when we think about wisdom and the wisdom Solomon had, he didn't always use it well. And so we need to be really careful. Josh?
You know, we instill in our children as Christians that they need to marry another Christian. We worry about the influence that one spouse can have on our children when they're grown. And this right here is a perfect example of why God did not intend for them to be this way. You know, they want them to marry, God preferred for them to marry Jewish people of the same religious practices they were, just because of this right here being led away from God.
That's right. You know, would I say that it's absolutely a sin to marry someone that's not a Christian? No, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but I'd say it was really, really a not wise thing. Sometimes we think about it and we hear people talk. We talk to people that's dating someone that's not a Christian and say, you really, really need to be careful about marrying them. And they say, oh, I can help them become a Christian. I can change them. So what we're saying there is, I'm smarter than Solomon, because Solomon probably thought the same thing, and it didn't work for him. The Bible clearly tells us that Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. If the wisest man, short of Jesus Christ, that ever lived, couldn't convert his foreign wives and make them followers of God, what makes me think in my feeble way that I can? And that's something we really need to think carefully about, because if we understand, and the Bible says when Solomon was old, his wives led him away and he departed from God, I don't get the impression that he came back. I mean, we can't prove that one way or the other, but if they led him away and he didn't come back, what good was having them? It was a vanity. I mean, he was a king, and we read, I think it's the book of, not Ruth, Esther, that king, his wife had done what he considered misbehaving, and they decided he's going to have another wife, so they went hunting for the best looking girls around for him. And so I have to believe that these 1,000 women that Solomon had was probably, in his mind at least, the best looking women around. I mean, if you're the king and you've got the income, you can afford 1,000 women, why would you go out and get a bunch of ugly ones when you could have 1,000 good looking ones? And so here we're looking at Solomon and his supposed to be wisdom. He didn't use his wisdom too good, I don't believe, in this aspect. So these physical desires that he had, trying to fulfill all of them, didn't work for him. Apparently it cost him his soul. So we need to be really careful when we think about the people we're going to associate with, even. Not just our spouse, but who we're going to associate and hang out with. When I was growing up, there was a phrase I used to hear from time to time, that birds of a feather flock together. And from a practical standpoint, you see that's true. Crows typically fly around with crows. Blackbirds hang out with blackbirds. Robins, all kinds of birds typically hang out together. And so the people that you hang out with is going to be the kind of people you become. If you hang out with good Christian people that's trying to help you go to heaven, that's how you're going to be, most likely. If you hang out with a bunch of heathens that's trying to get you to go do the things that we can read about here, this partying and all this stuff, that's how you're going to become. And so choose how you want to be, find people like that to associate with, and you'll be better off. James?
It was also some of his marriages were somewhat of a lack of faith in God, because the marriage that favored his daughter was an alliance marriage. And that seems like the Jews had a problem throughout their history of relying on Egypt to come save them from punishment God was sending them. But even now, it seems like Solomon didn't use his wisdom. He trusted in God, and he thought, well, let me just disobey him and make sure I've got somebody got my back.
Yeah.
And God truly had his back instead.
And I could see how he would think, this politically is a good deal. I won't have to worry about Egypt attacking because I'm married to the king of Egypt's daughter. Everything will be cool. Well, what Solomon needed to have had was the idea and the understanding that we're God's chosen people. And if we'll just be faithful to him, he's going to protect us. It don't matter who else tries to be a problem. God will take care of it. And we need to understand that in our lives, that ultimately, if we'll be faithful to God, it really doesn't matter what happens otherwise. God's going to take care of us. And that don't mean bad things aren't going to happen to us. But what it does mean, if we'll be faithful to God, we'll live with him in eternity in heaven, and that is him taking care of us. So compared to that, nothing else really matters. Tom?
When the Lord gave Solomon wisdom, he didn't limit it to just, spiritual wisdom. He allowed all wisdom in it. Solomon had the choice of weighing that against God's wisdom to see which one was more valuable. If you took humanistic things, like humanistic wisdom, that alliance with Egypt, and that was one of the first things he did in his, reign, was marry the daughter of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at that, wise, as wisdom, that was the way it's done. You go back and study history, like for Great Britain, England, Scotland, France, all that. That whole situation on that royalty type situation was all alliances.
Mm-hmm.
This one here would want to marry this one over here, so this one would give them the power to overcome that one, and back and forth. And even though it seemed like a good thing, there was all the turmoil. If you read the history of England and France and things, just what went on, why did Mary, Queen of Scots, want to go to France to, marry the son of the King of France, because she was trying to get an alliance to keep England from invading Scotland. Mm-hmm. And it just worked all that way, but it never really worked out. There was always problems with it, because when you did this one thing, it alienated somebody else. And you had to keep making these alliances and changes, and it kept, it went into affect your overall wisdom of how to do things properly.
Yeah, and as we see these alliances that we make sometimes, like we was talking about the people we hang out with, even though Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived, and the Queen of Sheba came to see him and ask him all sorts of hard questions about various different things. And it talks about the things Solomon knew about. He knew about physical things and agricultural things and animal husbandry kind of. He knew a lot about a lot of things. God had blessed him with that wisdom. But ultimately, it wasn't doing any good. And you can think about the people you hang out with. I've heard the phrase that the people in America, there was a dumbing down of Americans. I believe that in a lot of respects, we don't use our minds to think like people did in previous generations. We just kind of float along and follow the herd. And I think this is what happens when you associate yourself with bad people. You spiritually are going to be dumbed down. I know there's been times people I worked with in the past that was religious people, but they were denominational people. And if I wasn't careful, I'd let their things that they was talking about influence the way I thought, because I was with them a lot at work. So we've got to be really careful about that kind of thing. We've got to make sure that we're constantly coming back to the Bible and seeing what does the Bible say, and not letting the people we associate with dumb us down, spiritually speaking. So we've got to be real careful there. Let's see, where are we at? Question 8, and I didn't write the verse down that I got the answer with. Oh, here it is. Question 8 says, while Solomon was pursuing all these things, what happened to his wisdom? At the end of verse 9, it says, also my wisdom remained with me. So he's saying all the knowledge that I have, I still had it. All these things God had blessed him with, intellectually speaking, he still had it. It says, based on this, what kind of wisdom was this? I think in a great respect when we read about his life unfolded, that this wisdom that he had, that he said he still remained with him, would almost had to have been a worldly wisdom, not his spiritual wisdom. Because if it was a spiritual wisdom that he still had, he wouldn't have had these foreign wives. He wouldn't have made temples for their foreign gods and things like that. So we need to make sure and understand there's a difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. The world would have us do things one way, but God clearly has us do things in a different way. So we've got to make sure we understand that contrast there. And don't get the idea that, because I've had a bunch of worldly accomplishments like he talks about here in these few verses, that I'm a really sharp guy and I got all my act together. It may not be the case. We might have our worldly act together, but it could be our spiritual life is a wreck. Tom?
Our wisdom is based on current events, not long-term situations. Basically we see that with Solomon and a lot of the things that he did. They had short consequences, but that probably benefited initially. But the long-range consequences where, the spiritual wisdom of God is there. We see that with our politics today. If you go back and study American history, and you look at treaties and alliances and different things that our government interacted in, supposedly for the betterment of us, a lot of times they didn't work out. We funded terrorist groups to overthink something that we thought was worse at the time, but it ended up what we funded was, ended up being worse in the long run. And it goes on, from decade to decade. And here we had Solomon giving us that whole scenario up front, and we still go through and do the same thing. We don't look at long-range consequences. We look at the here and now. How do I benefit? It was really good for me now, but what's it going to be, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years from now? We do the same thing in decisions that we make from time to time. Yeah, we see this really nice car, like, you go back in the 1950s. That Edsel was really put up as a really great car. But a lot of people, they fall apart.
Yeah, they don't make them anymore.
And then we have that Yugo that we tried to import from, Russia to, that was a really cheap economical car. You could buy that. But it broke down about as soon as you got it off the parking lot. So, where do you go?
Yeah.
We still make those same mistakes, even though we quote, think that we're wise on doing things.
Mm-hmm. I heard one time in a program I was in, it talks about experience is the best teacher. They said as long as it's somebody else's experiences, you don't have to make all the mistakes yourself. And so as we look at these and talk about these things, we need to understand that while experience is the best teacher, we can learn a lot from Solomon's experience. We don't have to make all those same mistakes that he made ourselves. So we need to approach it from that standpoint as we're studying these things. Verse 10 says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. And so in verse 10, he's talking about, a question in the book says, relate verse 10 in your own words. It says, I done whatever I thought was fun. I done whatever I thought felt good. I done whatever I wanted to. And so again, that's what he's saying here. It was a self-centered idea, and he done everything that he wanted to do. He had, and it talks about here how well qualified was Solomon to do what he claimed in verse 10. Well, for a man that had $1.8 billion a year in income, I imagine he could afford financially, physically, to do whatever he wanted to. Plus, he was the king. Whatever he said goes. I mean, he could say off with his head or promote him to a higher position, whichever way he wanted to go with that. So he was in a position to be able to satisfy every desire that he had, and there wasn't anything anybody could do to stop him. Probably at this time, Israel was the most powerful nation in the world, and he was the king of that most powerful nation. So he was in charge. He could do what he wanted to do. And he said ultimately, these temporary physical desires, that his heart rejoiced in all those labors, that was his reward for all the, what do you get when you focus yourself on worldly things? You get a temporary worldly reward. Yeah, it's a nice feeling of accomplishment to say, I got a nice house, I got a nice yard, I got my fruit tree orchard up on the hill, I've got nice pastures, they're full of healthy fat cows. It's nice to say I've accomplished all that stuff, but if that's what your goal is just that physical reward, then you're just getting a temporary pleasure for it. That's your reward. And so we've got to be really, really careful that, as Tom was mentioning a minute ago, we're looking at a long-term reward for the works that we do. We're looking at the long-term goal and don't sell ourselves short. Let's see. Then it says here, the question 11 again, state the preacher's conclusion after this search that is described in verses 1 through 11. Verse 11 says, then I looked upon all the works my hand had done and all the labor on which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind, for there was no profit under the sun. So ultimately all this stuff he'd done, he's saying there really wasn't any profit to it. Because he's going to go on, we're not going to get through, but he's going to go on as he talks to a good bit in the rest of the chapter, and he's going to talk about, look at all this neat stuff I've done, and I've done a lot, I've accomplished a lot. But he's going to say sooner or later, I'm going to die, and somebody else is going to have it, and are they going to be wise like me, or are they going to be a fool? So Solomon's saying over and over here, what was the point of just having stuff? Because I'm going to die and it's going to be somebody else's. He says down through here, he says, what's the point of being really wise? Because the really wise man gets old or something happens to him and he dies, just like the fool does. And so if we focusing ourselves on worldly things, what's the point of being extra smart? Because it ain't going to accomplish you nothing in the long run. You're going to die. What's the point of having a bunch of stuff? You know, an over an abundance of stuff. Because it ain't going to accomplish you nothing in the long run. You're going to die. Just like somebody, you know, the rich man dies just like the poor man. Because we read the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in the New Testament. The rich man and Lazarus, I get the impression they probably died reasonably close to the same time. As far as physical stuff went, they was equal again then. The rich man didn't have a thing and Lazarus didn't have a thing. But it was their eternal goal, their eternal state that was what was important. Because even though Lazarus didn't have much stuff on this earth, he had a home in heaven. And the rich man had a bunch of stuff on this earth and he was in torment. So we need to, I think that's really the point. It says here in verses 18 through 21, what would you restate Solomon's sentiments in verse 18 through 21? And that's what Solomon was saying is, what is the point of all this stuff I've done? It's not going to do me any good in the long run. And so we need to focus our life on, as it says in verse 24, nothing is better than a man should eat and drink and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This I saw was from the hand of God. We need to have a spiritual focus on our life, spiritual goals in our life, and then the things we do work for and accomplish, we can enjoy them because we can understand and thank God for the blessings of them that He's given to us because we know they come from Him. The Scripture says that every good and perfect gift comes from God, comes from above. And so we focus on God, and then we're going to have that eternal reward just like Lazarus did. Tom, do you have something?
Things that we look at Solomon's life, the things that he should have focused on was maybe instructing his children, teaching him about God and things. Mm-hmm. And he, because of the situation then, evidently he relinquished that power to somebody else. And you look at his son Rehoboam coming on, but Rehoboam didn't use the wisdom of his father. He relied on his peers to help him make decisions. And his peers didn't have his best interests in sight. They had their own agenda that they wanted to follow. And that's a problem a lot of times, you know, we as parents make a lot of times. We focus on the here and now or making a living, and sometimes we don't focus on our children as much as we should. And consequently, all that working and, you know, doing those things didn't really help us out that much at all.
You know, you mentioned that Solomon apparently didn't do a good job with his children. We can see, I think, a consistent pattern in the Bible. Samuel, the last of the judges, his sons didn't turn out good. It appears that, you know, as we think about David, Absalom, and we read about things that went on in his family with his children. Some of them didn't turn out so good. We read about Solomon, and Rehoboam didn't turn out so good. As we go down and read about the kings of Israel, none of them turned out good. And the kings of Judah, maybe 50% or so of them turned out good. But it seems like some of these people spent too much time on the here and now and worldly things and not enough time teaching their children. So those of us with younger children or our grandchildren, let's make sure we apply a good bit of time to raising our children right. So even though we might be good people, we want to assure that they can be as good as they can be too with proper training. Thank you for your help and attention in class this morning.